So now I join Vercel and I kind of see this process actually being used, and like you can't seriously work like this.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of PowPod brought to you by NoRamp. Today, I'm joined by my CTO, Pepe Martinez, as well as the Vercel CTO, Malte Ubl. Malte, really nice to meet you. Glad to have you on the show. How you doing today?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Really, really excited. And Pepe, thank you for joining as well.
Thank you for having me.
For sure. So, yeah, just to give a quick introduction of Malta, he leads the development and delivery of the company's suite tools and features. Prior to joining Vercel, he was the principal engineer for Google Search Rendering, an engineering director for Google Search on laptops, tablets, and desktop. Malta has also created the front end infrastructure for a number of Google web apps and web at large, and is also the founder and curator of JSConf.eu. So, ton of stuff you've done, really exciting background. And yeah, Pepe, I'd love for you to get right into it.
I guess to start off, I have a question from a talk you gave actually 11 years ago, where it was at a NextConf. And you talked about how when you first started programming, you got Think C++ and you just wanted to build a Latin to German translator app, but you described it as, basically being given the raw parts and a welding tool to a bicycle. So I guess I wanted to ask, things have changed a lot over the last 11 years. And I guess two main things. One, the easiness of deploying on Vercel nowadays. And then even like, let's say the AI package you guys came out with recently, a young Malte could have built this in a weekend or 2 weekends, Latin to German translating app. So how do you feel about when you first started to today, how easy it is to maybe set something like this up?
Yeah, I'm probably gonna age myself, but it's a very long time since young Malta. It was like straight up in the middle of the 90s, and it was such a different world, right? I think I had the internet, probably just coming up to having the internet, and I was, this is literally the first program I ever wrote in my life. And C++ is not necessarily known as the best string manipulation language on the planet, so I was struggling with every single bit about it, right? And but this is an interesting question because I think I mean, even yeah, I guess 10 years ago, there would have been better programming languages. There had been like lots of research into natural language processing. I would have been a much better programmer, but it still would have been like somewhat difficult to actually deploy these apps. If you had asked me maybe 3 years ago, now, platforms like Vercel are on the market. It's so easy to just get started, do a quick weekend sprint, have something running. Now, like this year, especially for this particular problem space, right? Like there's problem spaces that are like basically the same way they are 3 years ago, but like LLMs are really good at translations, and especially with something as formal as Latin, where the input space is somewhat constrained. You're really like no one writes any new Latin anymore. So technically, you could have just like the database of all possible translations, but like yeah, the solution space is like opened up, right? And now you could specialize it in known LLM and have it go.
Yeah, no, it's crazy how, I mean, things have changed obviously a lot, but I would agree. Like just this problem space in particular over the last year, it's been crazy. I mean, you don't even need that many prompts or anything. Like the prompt can be 8 words, translate this from Latin to German, user input. And yeah.
Right. And because all I mean, this is again, it's a bit of a special case because literally every single Latin text ever is going to be in the model. But then even if that's not the case, we have actually like just over like, now we're talking last year, talking last month, okay? More and more of the LLM providers have come out with fine-tuning kind of tools for their networks. And that is actually very, very empowering for this particular space, right? Because you can basically just again like this problem where there is a set of data that kind of gives examples for the solution space, you can feed them to these LLMs, and you get substantially better results than you otherwise would without any of the constraints around context limitations. That's super exciting.
Yeah, no, I think it's super exciting that like young Malte could have built this in a weekend, and that's only because of some of the technology we have today, Vercel, the LLM space. Even in the last like month, it's crazy how things change, how fast. But yeah,
Yeah, I think maybe one term that's worth introducing is kind of the term of the AI engineer. which is a very different role, the way that's used now from like the artificial intelligent machine learning expert. And really kind of that's the big shift that we're seeing from like, okay, you like, 5 years ago, all the LLM community, like everyone knew each other, right? It was very like research heavy, very specialized, very mathy environment. And now you don't need nothing. All you need to know is how to call APIs, and you're good to go, right? And I think this kind of it also fits into like how Vercel is thinking about the world, where our main constituency are front end engineers who build very sophisticated front end, but they call all these APIs, and now the AI APIs basically just really fit into that pattern and empowering all these front end engineers to be very advanced AI engineers.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, that was going to be one of my follow-on questions to that is, how's Vercel thinking about this trend at large, where because of these advents of AI and all the companies coming around providing APIs, it is really easy to like start today and get a project up for almost anything. And it's really coming down to who can provide the best, I guess, user experience and UI on top of these APIs. How's Vercel thinking about this like at large of, more one-click deploys for fun apps that people want to build, like their own chatbot, etc.
Right. I think like the way we see our own role is primarily in terms of empowering people to actually get this stuff done. I think it's probably more, but like two primary challenges. One is that because of the way LLMs work, it's basically outputting one token at a time, and also being relatively slow at it. Like in computer terms, when you normally think about nanoseconds, and now you're talking like a few tokens per second. It's definitely a different world. And so that requires engineers who are talking to these LLM APIs to have to use different paradigms of how you invoke these APIs. And the main kind of paradigm change there is that you have to use streaming. And so what that means is if everyone who has used ChatGPT knows that if you ask it a question, it doesn't respond to you with the answer in one big response. You basically get one word at a time. And so everyone who is going to build some kind of a LLM-based application is going to have to deal with this streaming problem space. And that's just something that hasn't been particularly well established in this overall space because you kind of just didn't have to, right? Like most APIs were fast enough that you could just call them and then deal with the response when it's there. And so the way we see our space here is that we are going to give people the tools that make it really easy to deal with the streaming infrastructure. Which I must say, like this sounds like big strategy, but we got a little bit lucky because like we have been in a like multi-year process to roll out streaming as a capability on our platform, which included teaching it to React. So React had no streaming capability for server-side rendering until effectively last year. Let that sink in, right? So like literally the way the server-side rendering API worked is you called it and it gave you a string back and then you send it to the client, right? So it's a single invocation, zero streaming. And so it was clearly known that that wasn't the right way to do it. And so we've been on the project that include changing React, included changing Next.js, it's the most popular framework on top, and kind of bring it into everything. And then also changing our compute products to be able to do it. And so that kind of all landed. And then, holy crap, the LLMs need that thing, right? And we in a way just kind of got lucky, I must say, but like it's good serendipity.
Wow, no, that's a great backstory because I mean that's yeah, no, you guys got super lucky. It was perfectly lined up. Recently, I've used the the streaming package that you guys came out with because yeah, I mean there was no good other alternative or solution, and it kind of lined up perfectly that the LLM space really needs this, and like it completely changes your chatbot product immediately. The difference between streaming and the user just sitting there with a loader for 6 seconds. So yeah, that's amazing. Wow.
And you've mentioned in other interviews that Vercel is still a startup, and working at a startup, iteration velocity is key, right? You have to always think about, all right, how are we going to beat our competitors? The only way to do that is to build quick. Leading the technology side of things, how do you inspire that high velocity culture? How do you motivate your engineers outside of just pure salary?
Yeah, I think you already kind of used the right word there, which is culture. So it's really a culture thing. And by the way, this is actually also true at Google. where, especially in search, right? Ultra cash cow, you can really mess things up. You can really make big, big wins, but you kind of want to be sure about it. And so they had a lot of process, and it was basically it's the engineering director for Google Search, but my job to prove many of these launches. And honestly, like the way I had impact was many of my peers, even sometimes to convey status, they would take like days or weeks to approve a launch. And my personal SLA was 30 minutes. So when I had all the data, I would just go and say, thumbs up, let's go and get this out. And like in aggregate, this actually makes a huge difference, right? Like let's keeping the velocity up. But still you're at the speed of this like 100,000 employee company. It's going to be slower than a startup. I think in at the scale where Vercel is now, and I think this actually applies to many of our customers as well, is that we see first of all the culture of product engineering as the enabler. So and that it really comes down to ownership and the relationship of engineering to what you do, right? In the traditional sense, you often had engineering as being this function that is effectively a service function. It has to do something for someone, and this couldn't be further from the truth, right? Like at Vercel, we are engineers building a product effectively for ourselves, and so almost, maybe not always, like literally everyone in the company can make really high quality decisions by default, and so we definitely encourage that, and then have this ownership, trying to have a lack of fear and being empowered to kind of really get stuff out of the door. And then it's all about, what I call micro loops and macro loops. So micro loops is how, how long does it take from me putting something in my editor to seeing on my screen? How long does it take something from me saying, okay, this is now good enough, to my colleague seeing it live and working, right? And all of these kind of things, okay, maybe it's only 10% faster, but maybe that actually makes a big difference because now I saved them from looking at Reddit, right? And so that's the micro view. And then the more the macro side is where techniques like feature flags, for example, come into place, where first of all, you're not afraid to ship because A, it actually doesn't do anything because you haven't turned it on. And B, when you turn it on, you can always turn it back off. And you can then ship enhancement without them immediately being seen by everyone and so forth. So I think that's kind of the big space how you can like do fearless innovation at a very high pace.
Interesting thinking about it at the micro level first. It seems like you're definitely a fan of the Reid Hoffman. If you release something that you're not embarrassed about, you're too late. And it's cool thinking about that on the internal side of things as well. It's like, okay, I've built this. I'm going to show my colleague first, and then say, okay, now that the internal team's ready, we can release it to the public. That's really cool. It's like one extra step.
So Guillermo, our CEO, keeps mentioning the iPhone ship without copy and paste. Like what did you not ship in this, and why wasn't it last week? So like it's really actually a good thing to think about. Like there are all these things in the products that we ship that seem absolutely necessary, right? But so definitely it was copy and paste in 2007. So it's good to remind ourselves.
Yeah. No, I think something even too like I really like that you touched on those loops, because I think one of the biggest ones was probably like checking out your colleague's PR, pulling it, and then running it yourself locally versus them just being able to send you a preview deployment, and you're just like, okay, I could just see this live, clicking on one link. I think would easily one of the biggest loop closers. How quickly you could just share like your progress and even comment on.
And when we say micro, one of the things that's I think sets us apart from other platforms is the millisecond when we start building your PR is actually when you push it. So the build times, I mean, amortize about how long you take to write your PR description. So ideally, it's already done when you're very diligent about it. Maybe nowadays you use ChatGPT and it goes really fast, but it's one of those things you have to think about when you want to get like iteration velocity up. We recently made, again, another small change where we just make the URL available to share immediately. Like you can't see it yet because build takes however long it takes for your particular project, but that kind of takes, you can write that email or that Slack message right away again, amortizing, potential time that's hard to avoid, over like the human interaction that happens as well.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I mean, I'm used to sending the maybe on some staging branch like staging dot whatever, and then just saying check in 3 minutes or check in 2 minutes. The ability to just share that URL probably saves the other person maybe 2 minutes that they were on Reddit and not looking at and not refreshing. So no, it's amazing. I think, and those like those seconds save so much time in the end, especially when you add them up.
And you touched on Google a little bit in your last response. You spent a lot of time there. This was a big, and must have had a big impact on how you lead and function at Vercel. And I was thinking about scale. Google's obviously massive, right? You are focusing on Google search, which is obviously one of the most used products at Google. You switched from this much larger organization to a smaller startup, which is still later stage, of course. What are the biggest differences in going from Google to a Vercel?
I'd say it's definitely the week over week change. So Vercel, so I've been here now for like 19 months or so. Um, and and it's a very different company from when I joined. I joined kind of in the middle of hyper growth. There was new people starting every week, and also the first engineering managers had only been hired like a couple of months before I joined, and we're still kind of finding their place. And the only way how you could describe what was going on was kind of like I think a beehive is appropriate, where it's not disorganized because the company was like reliably shipping at a good high quality product at a fast pace, but most organization was in a way emergent, right? Like it's just people kind of figuring it out, and it's definitely been like transformed since then in quite a big way. So you definitely see change that at Google would happen in a year, you would see in 2 days, literally, right? And change that in Google would happen over 10 years would happen, maybe in 6 months or so. I think that's the biggest differentiator.
I mean, having all that, say, manpower, just the amount of teams, the amount of people, just for sheer speed. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. But that's really cool.
Yeah, and on the other hand, Google's also like not, I like working there. It's the way to understand this company is a very fractal company. Like my team on the Google search side was actually smaller than the team at Vercel is now, but they are kind of a verticalized organization. So my team was like owned the overall product, but there would be some team that might even be bigger than us owning travel, shopping, or literally like some sub sport, soccer, basketball. So like, and there's always 100 engineers in all these like verticals. And so the amount of like cross team sync you have to do to get that running is incredibly difficult, right? Compared to like Versailles basically being like one of these teams, very clear vision, very clear idea what we're going to do, and kind of but also kind of the conviction about certain things that makes it able to do longer lasting projects, which in a way is almost ironic, right? You would think mature organization would be better at this, but it's actually become extraordinarily hard at Google to make long-term bets. Like after 3 months, your SVP would come and say, "Hey, Malte, we need to see how this is gonna, work," and then lose interest, right? And on the other hand, at Vercel, it's absolutely possible because we know there's certain things that are going to take us a while, and we have the ability to pull them through.
There's just so many pros and cons to bigger and smaller organizations for sure.
Yeah, I was gonna ask too, like, or I guess your overall thoughts on open versus closed source nature, especially in how long a project may last. Like something like Next, I guess allows so many people to comment on it, changes, propose different ideas, and almost like elongates the longevity of it just because there's a larger community working on it. Versus most things at Google are usually closed source and internal to the company, where someone might not ever see the light of day, someone that is interested enough to continue like moving it forward. How do you feel about that whole landscape between open and closed being from Google and now at Vercel?
Yeah, I would actually say that really the philosophies aren't even that different, but what is different is kind of the emphasis. So if you put yourself in the position of the buyer in the abstract sense, because the open source project is free, right? The person who selects like Next.js to be the thing that runs one of the most important parts of the company, like if I'm that person, I want to, be able to understand it fully. I want to be able to make its existence not depend on the, future of some startup like Vercel. And I want to be able to like, if the project goes a different direction that I'm not happy with, be able to kind of continue maintaining it. My personal favorite anecdote is this is 15 years ago, so not that long ago. Okay, 15 years ago, like the internet was already a thing. Web 2.0 was like in full swing, and I was at a consultancy and we are building an airline website, and it was running on IIS, Internet Information Server, which is Microsoft's Windows-based web server, and we had performance problems, and we didn't have a support contract with Microsoft. And so I was looking literally at the UI, like there was like a, Windows settings dialog for this like heavy production grade web server. And there was a checkbox that was labeled burst mode. It's like, that sounds interesting, right? Like I have a performance problem, like maybe I need to activate burst mode. And so I checked, I Googled it, 50 years ago, Google was already told me things. I Googled it with Microsoft documentation for this checkbox, and the docs say activates burst mode. And that was it. And I was, that made it so clear for me, like how absolutely impossibly like insane it is to run this piece of production critical software that I can't understand. Like you just cannot be in that situation where you have this problem. And so that's why I think there's just this broad consensus that the things that you run as production infrastructure yourself, you have to like deeply understand. And so I think Next kind of falls into this bucket, and hence has to be open source.
Yeah, in general, you can think of so many projects that have lasted longer. I don't know if Wiz is still going at Google, but yeah, I mean, the whole closed source versus open source nature in general just leaves, yeah, if you don't know whether activating burst mode will completely fry the server or make things faster, it's hard to decide whether, and it's just one button. It's like a big red button.
Yeah, I mean, since you brought up Wiz, and I've mentioned this story before, like where this could have been open source, right? Like one of the interesting questions is if you don't intend to make it a big deal, right? So Next.js is like company back. We use it ourselves. We want people to use it, right? It's important for Vercel's future that gets a lot of adoption. If we had so open source, Wiz is this framework I built at Google, which is very heavily used there and still maintained. And 10 years ago, I was considering whether to open source it. And because it didn't have any strategic benefit for Google to open source it, there are two questions. A, there's maintenance effort now for Google. And B, it was at a time where people talked a lot about JavaScript fatigue, like a new framework every week. I mean, still seems to be the thing, but like it was already a thing back then. And so I was just kind of thinking, okay, maybe this doesn't add enough to the state of the art that's worth burdening the community about it. But I still have like by now I've come to the very firm conclusion that that was a mistake. But it was just me misreading kind of the ecosystem in the sense that I didn't basically realize how much it contributed to the state of the art, and it basically has taken until literally this year for the state of the public art to kind of catch up. And by the way, I don't mean this in the sense that it was better than what you can do right now. It was in many ways a very horrible framework. And the team that's maintaining it now is fixing this. The primary way of adding React's programming model to Wiz, which is the right choice. But Wiz basically had very advanced server-side rendering and especially very advanced kind of lazy hydration in its playbook, and that is something that now React server components kind of bring to the table. Google Search actually is a great example. Like in the classic kind of front-end app, the way people are still building it a lot today, if you have a lot of features, but not every feature is used by every user every single time, you're still loading all that code, right? And Google Search is the extreme example because there's thousands of features for like some weird sport in some country you've never been to that you're never going to see, right? And so you absolutely need some tech that will not load the JavaScript for that app unless you really kind of make that query.
No, definitely. I mean, yeah. I mean, let's say in Next we have route based bundling, but on something like Google Search, it's just the one route.
There's one route. Yeah, exactly. Like, so you better need something more complex.
Right. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I know I find it interesting that Wiz is still going, and now it's borrowing things from the open source world, like from React, to do almost a revamp. Very interesting. Yeah. No, I think you've also compared Wiz, some of the features of Wiz, to Quick. Yeah, there is still, it's still the same. We still have a new a new framework every week. It's like an advent calendar.
The way I now think about it is about generations. So I think that, like Quick and Next.js 13 app router and Astro are one generation of frameworks, whereas Next.js with Pages Router, Remix, and a whole bunch of others, they're kind of last iteration. I know Remix is kind of building their next iteration as well, but as you're making choices now, there's always like a bunch of good options that are kind of in the same generation. And the luxury of 2023 is that all these options are kind of good, which is a pretty good place to be.
Yeah, no, really good. I know Astro recently partnered with you guys as the main deploy for Astro as well. So I mean, between you can pick either Astro or Next and get up in 43-second builds. So it is crazy like the amount of good options there are today. Because I think actually you've touched a lot about this of the difference between companies that are making millions of dollars in revenue and billions of dollars like Google. They just have more resources to do a lot more things, like have their own team for their own framework all internally. A lot of startups don't have that luxury. So having these like open source, frameworks that are actually really good, helps a lot. I mean, how else would we, build large scale JavaScript applications without an entire internal Wiz team?
And no one would really do that work, right? But also I mean, you could argue that it's important for the companies that can afford it to sponsor the work, but that's a whole different kind of worms.
No, very true. Like, I guess like React for Facebook. I heard you talk about this before, that overall, one of the things you want to do at Vercel over the next couple of years is sort of bring a lot more of those tools and features from large companies like Google. The particular example I'm thinking of is Google Analytics and how well they understand not the public product, but Google's analytics of Google search, how well they understand the user, the A/B testing, sort of bringing that to the millions of dollars a year revenue companies that can't have an entire team just focused on implementing A/B testing and understanding the user that deeply. Maybe you could touch a little bit about like maybe some future ideas or products that you think Vercel might introduce to bridge that gap between big billion-dollar companies that can afford these teams to do this and like the streaming API. Like I'm sure Google has an internal package for a streaming API, but you guys have brought this down to companies like us.
Yeah, maybe actually I start with the streaming API because streaming is like a broad space, and the streaming that we've brought to Next.js is different from the, I would say, classic streaming. And Google actually doesn't have the advanced one. The advanced one comes from a Facebook technology that they call BigPipe. And I think the right word for naming it would be out of order streaming. So in the traditional streaming, which you, for example, get in PHP by default, is that you think about your buffer as a linear thing. And so you basically, your HTML generation is just writing to that buffer, right? And then whenever you have to wait because you wait for a database, you just stop. And then the database comes back and then you keep writing. That's actually not how Next.js 13 streaming works at all. And that is actually quite revolutionary. So the way it works is when it has to halt because you're waiting for a database, it goes up the render tree and keeps rendering. And so stuff below it actually does come out on the buffer. And then the way to think about it is that eventually when the database comes back and you can actually render that subtree, it actually emits a bit of JavaScript that inserts that content up above in the DOM. And so that what you can, for example, do, very, very easy example, is you have a product detail page and there's two dynamic things you want to put on it. One is below the fold, the like recommendations. And that works well on the traditional streaming because you kind of push out the static part up top and then you eventually put the recommendations. But if the second dynamic part is whether you logged in the classic streaming, you would now have to block the database call whether you logged in and your session is valid. and that blocks the entire page because that's technically below it, right? And so in Next.js's new rendering model, you can absolutely do that in a most performant way, and you don't really have to understand that that's how it works, right? It kind of just is the natural flow of going there. So that's a big kind of enabler, and it's a type of engineering that clearly even Google wasn't willing to invest, and where you kind of have to really get the scale of open source to get to the level of fidelity.
Yeah, I was gonna say the fidelity that you guys do is incredible. In the sense that, like, I just in general in the apps, the new app router, the way in which, let's say you have like 4 or 5 async like calls at the top of the function, the fact that other ones are allowed to run versus, let's say, in get static props back then, the whole entire thing has to load. I think just the way that you guys ship products in general, and I think you've tweeted about this in a very funny way, where there's either incremental migrations or failed migrations.
I actually wrote a blog post about this as well, that we published, I think, last week, where it's one of these, like, when you're in the industry for a couple of decades, you realize that migrations that aren't set up for getting stuff validated early, getting stuff out early, are just, eventually going to turn into those. I mean, I mentioned earlier how at Google it's no longer possible to do multi-year projects. It's very, very much that situation where, like, maybe even you get consensus it's going to take you a year, but after 3 months or so, someone's going to ask, like, can you give me any type of validation that this is going to work? And so you need some notion of incremental rollout to get this early validation going.
Yeah, it's better to say, well, part of it is already working, and and you can yes.
I think, but one of the things that we're bringing from my and some of my colleagues earlier work at Google is this notion of conformance, where the big insight is that engineers are not, like all humans, not great at retaining some like training information or always getting everything right, but computers are good at this. And so what conformance entails is basically just automatic checking of kind of application layer opinions about how code should be written. And so, like, if you can express kind of what technically the architect would kind of decide about your application in some machine comprehensible way, which obviously LLMs now definitely changed what that means. You can really scale organizations in a way that is just very difficult to do by hand. And so that's a big investment that we've been making at Vercel and trying to kind of democratize that level of fidelity to the broader engineering community.
No, I think it's really, what you guys do for myself as an engineer and engineers around the world is really amazing. I think one thing I definitely wanted to ask you about was Vercel Spaces product. Especially the more engineers you have in a team, the more difficult it gets. And I know you've touched on this. I think in the talk you only gave a couple months ago. Well, it might have been it was either JS Conf or another next conf. Oh, React Summit. Yeah, it was React Summit. Where like, GitHub code owners is not the best product. So yeah, if you could touch a little bit about Vercel Spaces. I know it's private beta and everything, but
It's in private beta, but like it's rolling out to more of our customers. So like as soon as we get through the first round of feedback, we're gonna make it available more widely. And I think the core of that product is really the conformance idea. And so for enforcing, again, these opinions about code, I give you a good one because it's really about gray area. So and I use the same example in my talk because I think it's one of the most powerful ones. So middleware is a concept in Next.js that runs before serving requests. So like it's very performance critical, and making fetches can be very slow. And so you probably shouldn't use that in a middleware, but it can't be always avoided, right? Like, I mean, sometimes the whole point of being able to write a program is to talk to some backend that can't be avoided. But I think it's fair to say that it's so much of a foot gun that you definitely want some extra review. And so the way conformance works is, first of all, it lets you express that using fetch in a middleware may require extra review. And that's a completely transitive thing, right? Because it could be very far down the abstraction tree from like whatever you think you're doing in your middleware, right? So it scans your entire code base and all your dependencies. And then it says, okay, it's not like this is illegal, but it needs extra review. And so So basically, it generates an allow list entry for this change, but this allow list lives in a different directory. And that directory has different rules around who can approve changes in that directory. And that's kind of where the need to have some mechanism to express these different kind of approval mechanisms come in. And the way I think about GitHub code owners, which does support expressing this, I think generally it's certainly designed for the size of repository that you see in like more the traditional Git sense. But now that I think the world is moving to monorepos, these repository gets more extended, and it actually doesn't make a lot of sense to have a single global configuration file. In fact, I think it's almost always a bad idea. And instead, the owners product that we're providing, which is directly modeled on how Google and Facebook are doing this, is that in a directory, you can say put an owners file and basically say these are the approvers for this directory. And very importantly, the owners can change it themselves. The global file has that problem that if you allow people to make changes, then you kind of don't have a lot of control. Whereas, so you need to lock it down, but locking it down means now every change has to go through some kind of crazy process. Whereas this, teams can self-manage. So it's just, it's in a way a small change, but it's actually very fundamental change of how that process works and how organically it can flow into an organization.
Yeah, definitely. I think you've touched a lot about on this, I guess, topic in general of like these small things though that take just an extra 20 seconds. Well, maybe depending on the company, right? If it's like async and maybe like everyone's work from home and they're doing laundry, you might have to wait a while to get approved to do that change. So and that just delays the entire like workday. I think also I loved how you talk about this a lot too of the whole monorepo movement over the last like couple of years. Where it's just when you have your own private npm packages in a company and you change some version, just that all the friction points in the general shipping process. I do love the amount of things that Vercel is doing to get rid of those friction points because they just slow the shipping. Yeah.
This is so interesting because I was working for Google through the entirety of the movement of kind of small modules, small packages in the Node.js ecosystem. And I was seeing that, looking at that from the outside and having actually lots of discussions around like what I call Google's large social experiment of having a single repository all at a single version. And so now I join Vercel and I kind of see this process actually being used, and like you can't seriously work like this, right? And obviously, we also the company driving monorepos, and so over like the time I've been here, we've made a lot of progress migrating our own code bases to monorepos, and kind of seeing how the friction it reduces, and and that all comes with the background of introducing new complexity. Like it's very clearly like if you make it easier for people to have dependencies on each other, then you have more dependencies, and that makes your code base in some ways more complex. But I'm now very convinced that it nets out on the positive side.
I would say even in like let's say a new engineer onboarding, right? Having to give him an entire handbook on every package that's used and 19 different repos versus saying you can just run one Docker Compose file and this will spin up. Make sure you have enough RAM on your computer we ship to, but this will spin up all 19 services. Yeah, I think it's a huge change for the space in general, and I do love what you guys are doing to make these things even better. All these friction points.
And want to be respectful of time. I know we've asked a ton of questions here. Just want to end on asking where you think the industry is going. Obviously, we can't ask what new products and features Vercel is going to release, but is there something that you're focusing on in a more general sense that Vercel is trying to take advantage of and position best for?
Yeah, there's definitely several things. So we just talked about monorepos. I think that trend is going to continue. And the way that the role we see is that we are like your partner in the adoption, and we're living it ourselves, and we're building the tools that are needed to scale these monorepos because we need them ourselves, but because we also develop a tooling company that sells these tools, we're going to make them available to everyone. So that's one big trend that I think is going to continue. Then very focused on front-end engineering, which is going through a very large transformation to composable architecture. What this means is that you used to buy some software like your CMS, your shop system, and it kind of did the front end, the back end all together. And this is definitely transforming to a system where these systems still exist, but they become APIs, and you build your own front end for it. Because as a larger internet business, you need to control your own destiny, and like that opens up this need for some place for that code to run, and that's basically Vercel, right? So that's how we see ourselves in the market as the front end cloud, and how where we're seeing that this transition to be accelerating every day. And kind of maybe then also coming to the last point, obviously there's AI, and AI is a good example for why composable architecture is so important. Because let's say you bought some kind of shop system and you wanted to integrate AI features. Like in the old world, you had to ask your vendor to put it on their roadmap and wait 2 years, right? Whereas now you just call the LLM API and you integrate some kind of semantic search or so forth, right? And so that transformation we talked about earlier in the podcast about how all these engineers that you already have on staff that might not be the best linear algebra math whiz on the planet, but they can call these APIs, right? And so they can all become AI engineers and without really having to learn any particularly new skills. And so I think that's going to be absolutely transformative, both to like the things we can build, how we build, and kind of the type of software that's being written in the future.
Malta, thank you so much. Really enjoyed the conversation. I'm glad you and Pepe were able to nerd out on the technical side. It's been fun listening to you two chat, and it was great meeting you as well.
I loved it. Thanks for having me. This is cool.
Best of luck to you in Vercel.
Thank you, boy.